Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to be with everyone to study some Torah. Today's Torah portion is Tazria and Metzora. It's a double Torah portion. If you're following along in the blue Oxford Chumash, it is found on page 608. The first of the two Torah portions is page 608. I want to try to do things a little bit different today than the past Zoom classes, and that is I would like some more interaction if possible. So if you have questions, just type in your question. It'll come up on my screen on the right side, and I'll try to address your questions as we go along. So feel free to interject with your questions by typing it in whenever you have a question. Like this, we could have more of a conversation, even though we're not in person. I hope everyone's doing well. Today is, of course, Tuesday. Tuesday is the most blessed day of the week. Our rabbis say it's the day that God said twice, Ki Tov. So it's a double day of goodness. Tov la Shamayim, but Tov la Bria is good for man and good for God, our rabbis say. And in addition to that, it's Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. And at 5 o'clock today, we'll have a commemoration together with none other than Jacqueline Goldman, one of our Holocaust surviving members, who's 93 years old, and she has a fascinating story. So, as we begin today's Torah portion, page 608, Tazria. So, you know, there's a Yiddish expression that the Alter Rabbi, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, said. He said, "Medaf leben mit der Zeit." You got to live with the times. What does it mean to live with the times? So, you know, people always say you got to get with the times. But what does it mean to live with the times? So it doesn't mean the New York Times or any other times. It means the Torah times. Why? Because every week we read a Torah portion. And that's God speaking to us that week with the message of that week. In other words, even though the Torah was given 3,332 years ago, and very soon on the holiday Shavuos will commemorate the anniversary of the giving of the Torah, nonetheless, the Torah portion of the week is God speaking to us anew each year. And if there was ever a Torah portion that fits with the times, it's this week's Torah portion. Actually, this week's double Torah portion. Because the subject of this week's double Torah portion is what we're all living through, which is quarantine. That's right. 3,332 years ago, the Torah spoke about quarantining. And that's the subject of this week's Torah portion. The laws of quarantining. What is the subject of this week's double Torah portion? Primarily, when I say primarily, I mean at least 90%, is about something called saras. Saras is translated loosely in English as leprosy, but that's not really the translation. Leprosy is a modern condition, a condition that's a medical condition. This was a spiritual form of leprosy. We all know this. When Moshe Rabbeinu's sister Miriam spoke Lashon Hara, she spoke gossip, she spoke ill words about her brother Moshe. She went to her brother Aaron and said, "Did you hear Moshe, our brother, separated from his wife?" And what did God do? God struck her with saras, with leprosy. And she had to go outside of the camp to be quarantined from the rest of the camp. But the one who spoke Lashon Hara, the one who spoke ill, gossip, has to be isolated outside of the camp for 7 days until the Kohen inspects him. And then if he's not clean, he has to come wait another 7 days until he's eventually re-entered into society, readmitted into society. Now, this is so relevant because we're all experiencing quarantining now, but also because the subject of speech is perhaps more relevant now than ever before. Because while we're quarantining, we're spending more time than ever on social media. And today's generation is blessed with social media. Without social media, we couldn't be in touch with each other right now learning Torah. Without social media, we couldn't stay in touch with our friends and family during this whole pandemic. But we also know there are many pitfalls to social media. And what are the pitfalls of social media? That there's a lot of words that are spoken, are communicated, expressed on social media that are very damaging, they're very hurtful, that are very painful, they're very full of venom and hatred. As Jews, we surely experience that. Anti-Semitic comments and words and websites. This week's Torah portion discusses such a fundamental subject, the subject of guarding our lips. And in ancient days, the punishment was that you were quarantined outside the camp until you learned the lessons of not speaking Lashon Hara, not speaking gossip or speaking slander. But before we get into that lengthy subject, which is so relevant, and try to learn the lessons and apply it to the times we're living in now, I want to start with the opening subject of this week's Torah portion, which has nothing to do with Lashon Hara, which is the broader subject we'll get back to in a moment. The opening subject of this week's Torah portion is about childbirth, something none of us men experience, but all the women who are learning with us today know about it, or at least those women who have had children. The Torah tells about the laws of giving birth to a child. Now, the first question you may say is, if the entire two Torah portions about Lashon Hara, why do we start with exactly the first 8 verses talking about childbirth? What does childbirth have to do with Lashon Hara? As I said, 98% of the parshas are about Lashon Hara, and then the opening 8 verses is about childbirth, and actually the very end of Metzora, which is the end of the double Torah portion, talks about a woman's, goes back to the subject of childbirth and talks about a woman's menstrual cycle and the laws of nida, purity and impurity. We all know the laws of mikvah for a woman who gave birth, so the bookends of the two Torah portions about women and childbirth and the laws of mikvah. And then in the middle, you have the majority of the two Torah portions talking about Lashon Hara, speaking gossip, slander, negative speech, and the consequences of the punishment of tsaras, like Miriam was afflicted with tsaras, and the laws of quarantining, and the lessons and the application to only speak the opposite of Lashon Hara, which is Lashon Tov, good speech. So why is childbirth the introduction to all of this? Nothing's by chance. There has to be a reason that God would put this as the introduction. And so the Rabbi says as follows. He says, when God gives us leprosy, I was learning with my sons this morning, with Uziel and Mendel. And we were learning these laws, and I asked them the following question. I said, if God asks you, would you like to reintroduce tsaras for negative speech? That anytime someone speaks Lashon Hara, negative speech about someone else, I just want to tell you something what the Talmud says, something to think about. The Talmud says that Lashon Hara harms 3 people. We always think Lashon Hara harms the person who it's spoken about. But the Talmud says it kills 3 people. Emotionally, it kills 3 people. It kills the one who was spoken about. It kills the one who spoke it, and even the one who listened to it. So there are 3 people who are hurt by Lashon Hara. And the speaker and the listener are as hurt as the one who listens to it, who it's spoken about. And we could all understand why. Speaking Lashon Hara defiles your own character, your own being, your own mouth. Now, the Chafetz Chaim once made a beautiful observation about Lashon Hara. He said, imagine a doctor performing a surgery, but he's using instruments, scalpels and instruments that are contaminated. Not only won't he heal the patient, he'll kill the patient with the germs and the infections and the contamination. He says, God gave us only one mouth. The same mouth we have to pray to God with is the same mouth we have to speak about others with. If we contaminate our mouth with negative speech, and then we turn to God in prayer and ask for things with the same mouth that is infected, that is contaminated, that is poisoned with the negative speech, then we're using an instrument to talk to God with that is contaminated, like a doctor performing a surgery with an instrument that is contaminated. Not only won't it be effective, it could be harmful. And so therefore, first, more readily, keep your mouth sterile, keep it clean, keep it pristine, do not defile it. But even the one who listens, and this is maybe the biggest challenge of Lashon Hara, person may say, you know what, I don't speak Lashon Hara. I never speak bad about others. Now, of course, I just want to say there are times in life you have to speak bad. If you have to discuss something that's relevant, if you're a parent and you have to talk about your children's behavior, or if you're a patient and you have to tell your therapist something you experienced because you're experiencing emotional anguish from it, or if you are an employer and you have to talk to someone, an employee, about something negative. There are times that it's necessary in life to speak bad, but it should never be done with malice, with ill intent, and it should only be done for constructive purpose. And you may say, well, Miriam spoke to Aaron about Moses for a constructive purpose. She was concerned about her brother separating from his wife. But the rabbis say, first talk to the person. If she was concerned about Moshe Rabbeinu, she should have spoken to Moshe. And then, if she couldn't make headway with Moshe, she could have gone to the brother. In other words, if you have an issue with someone, first address it with them. If you're not successful, you need to speak to a third party to help. Sometimes you have an intervention to get a person to get help. But you have to try with the person himself. Don't go behind their back and speak to a third party without addressing it with them first. There's a flow, there's an order how to deal with things. So not only is the person who's spoken about, or rabbis say hurt, not only the person who spoke it, it's the person who listens to it. And this is the biggest challenge. So when someone says Lashon Hara to you, you have to say, I don't want to hear it. You know, people today are very sensitive to secondhand smoke. You know, if you want to smoke, don't do it in my presence, because I don't want to be affected by the pollution, by the contaminants of the secondhand smoke. Well, if we're concerned about physical harm from secondhand smoke, we have to be concerned with spiritual harm of secondhand Lashon Hara. If it's in my earshot and I'm listening to Lashon Hara, please don't contaminate, don't pollute my environment. Just like today, we're very sensitive to pollution. If somebody starts polluting, we tell them to stop because you're harming others. So too, negative speech is harmful to others. But going back to childbirth, which is the opening subject of this week's Torah portion, why is that the opening? So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says that the reason God afflicts us with leprosy is so we should learn a lesson and change our ways and our behavior and refrain from speaking Lashon Hara. And when you learn to live a life without negativity, without spewing negativity and hatred and negative comments about others, it's like being born again. It's like a new birth. You're like a new creation. You experience a whole new life. And no one said it better than King David in the book of Psalms. He says, who is the person who seeks life? You want to have a long life. Everyone wants the secret to longevity, long life. King David in the book of Psalms says, you know what the secret to longevity is? It's not some drug. It's not some lotion. It's not some potion. It's guard your tongue from speaking evil. Metzora l'shoncha me'ra, usfatecha midaber mirma, and your lips from speaking deceit. King David, the wisest, a great king, greatest king of Israel, says in the book of Psalms, if you want to lead a long and happy life, don't speak evil of others, because you poison your own soul as well as harm others when you do so. So I was going back to my kids. I said to my boys, I said, if you could vote, if God put out a vote, and this is my chance to ask you to tell me your thoughts. If God said, I'm giving you a choice, would you like me to reintroduce saras, leprosy, that anytime a person spoke negatively about others, they were afflicted with leprosy, white blotches on their skin, and they had to be quarantined to get better. Would you vote for it? And my kid said no, because they said everybody speaks Lashon Hara, we'd all be afflicted with saras. And I actually said, I think I would vote for it, because I think people would very quickly learn to stop speaking Lashon Hara. Just like you learn not to do other things that are harmful for you, because you want to preserve your health and your well-being. People would realize there's a consequence, there's a price to be paid for speaking Lashon Hara. And people would stop speaking negativity, or else they would be exposed. You see Lashon Hara, someone could speak Lashon Hara, and then they smile at the guy the next day, pretend like they never spoke behind their back. Now, oh, you got white blotches on your skin. You were talking about somebody, and you're exposed for the fraud and the phony and the Lashon Hara person you are. So people would very quickly, just like you don't want to walk around with dirty stains on your clothing, you're careful nothing gets on your clothing. And by the way, one of the forms of saras was your clothing, and even the house could be afflicted with saras. We'll talk about that later. But people would obviously be very careful. And immediately, if God reintroduced saras like in biblical times, there would most probably be a huge reduction Maybe even as high as 70, 80% of Lashon Hara would cease from the world. Imagine you would go on internet sites and you would never see negative comments or bad mouthing of other people. It would be a wonderful world. So the Rebbe says, why does childbirth, why is that subject a prelude for the subject of Lashon Hara? Because when you learn to master your speech, to be in control of your language, of your words, and not only don't you speak negatively, but you learn to point out the good in others, to see the good in others, to dwell on the positive in others rather than to dwell on the negative in others, you're transformed. It's a new life. It's like you're born again. It's like you're a new child. You live a brand new existence. And therefore, the subject of childbirth is saying God doesn't want to punish a person by giving him leprosy. God wants to bring them to a greater existence. And this week's Torah portion, especially in a week that we are isolated at home, it gives us a lot of food for thought about this subject of being isolated. And the reason we're isolated, our rabbis say, is two reasons. Why does the person who speaks Lashon Hara get isolated? First of all, because they have to be removed from society. Because when you speak ill, you harm others. Just like today with social distancing, person who has corona has to be isolated. Why? Because they could spread it. You tell one person, they tell the next person, they tell the next person. Before you know it, your word spread. Like the famous story of the man who came to the Chaim and he said, I spoke Lashon Hara, what's my tikkun? How can I be Lashon Hara? Which, by the way, the Talmud says it's one of the sins you can't be forgiven for because you can't retract your word in the sword. So Chavetz Chaim says, take a pillow, he tells the man, on a windy day and rip it open on your rooftop. So he waits for a particularly windy day, he goes to his rooftop, he rips open the pillow, and then he comes back to the Chavetz Chaim and he says, am I forgiven now? And he says, no. Now go collect all of the feathers. He said, I can't. They've flown all over town. They're in every courtyard and on every rooftop of the city. He says, that's my point. Your words are like the feathers of the pillow. They've flown all over town. They're being gossiped about in every home now. You can't retract them. You can't undo the harm. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, as they say, and therefore it's impossible to do tshuva for Lashon Hara. Even if you ask the person for forgiveness, the harm is irreparable. So going back to childbirth, here we find something fascinating. Torah talks about the laws of a woman, that she shouldn't go to the temple for 40 days for a boy, 80 days for a girl. She's in a state of uncleanliness, which we can talk about what that means. It doesn't literally mean physical, it means spiritual. She should stay home and not go to the temple. And after the 40 days for a boy or 80 days for a girl, she goes to the temple and brings an offering. Also introduces the laws of circumcision for a boy after 8 days. So there are many questions that come to mind. The first question is, why is a woman unclean? Because she gave birth. There's nothing more miraculous, more wonderful than childbirth. Yes, it's painful, but there's nothing more miraculous. Why would that induce a period of uncleanliness? Second of all, why is it double for a girl than for a boy? Third of all, why does she have to bring a sacrifice? What did she do wrong? What does she have to atone for? You could say it's a sacrifice for thanksgiving, gratitude, but usually an elevation offering is for atonement, not for thanksgiving. So why would she bring an elevation offering? So I want to take you back to the first birth of the first human child. You know, it's fascinating. Childbirth still evokes so much emotion and so much awe. If you've ever witnessed the birth of a child, your child, you say you feel God's presence. They say there's no atheist in a foxhole and there's no atheist in a delivery room. So childbirth is miraculous, but imagine how miraculous it was for the first couple to give birth to the first human child. You know, we've experienced this many times. We know it exists, and it's still, we look at the newborn baby and we say, wow, this is a miracle. But imagine Adam and Eve, when they had their very first child, Cain. The very first humanly conceived biological child. Unlike Adam and Eve, who were made by God, Cain was the first human being to be created through childbirth. And what's fascinating is that the first human child that was ever born turned out to be a murderer. He actually murdered his own brother out of jealousy. So we have to understand something. How could the first human creation, the first child, be a murderer? And one of the things the rabbis point to is as follows. What is the name Cain? In Hebrew, everyone says Cain, C-A-I-N, but in Hebrew it's Cain. And the Torah says when Chava, Eve, gave birth, imagine a woman giving birth for the first time, sees how her body produces a child. She says the following words. She says, Kaniti ish et Elokim. I've acquired a child through God. And a rabbi's point that it's very interesting that she used the word, I've acquired a child through God. The word kayan, from the word kinyan, means acquisition. Why would you use the word acquisition? You acquire a house, you acquire a car, you acquire possessions, you acquire a child? And our rabbis, amongst the many layers of commentary, there's 70 facets to the Torah. It's not the literal interpretation. Literal interpretation, she says, I've created a child with God. And she feels blessed that she could co-create. A woman has the privilege that a man doesn't have. A woman could be a co-creator. She and God work for 9 months together. God works through the womb of the woman to create a child. It's an amazing experience, an amazing miracle. But based on the fact that she says, I've acquired a God, a rabbi said this was the fatal mistake of Eve. Your children are not your possessions. Your children were entrusted to you, and you are the guardians to watch over them, to raise them properly in the spirit of the service of God. God entrusted you with a holy task to raise his children on earth. But you don't own the child. They're not your possessions. If you think your child is your possession, that can, God forbid, lead even to a child who becomes a murderer. It's a very extreme and powerful thought, but has a very fundamental lesson. Contrast Eve, who says, I've acquired a child, to Abraham, who when God says, take your son and bind him at Mount Moriah and bring him as an offering, Abraham says, I will give God, because it's not my child. I don't own this child. It's not my possession. God gave it to me, and therefore I have to do with the child as God instructed me. In many cults, by the way, in many other religions, especially in biblical times, the culture was something called Moloch, where people sacrificed their children because they thought they owned their children. I could sacrifice my child. And God says, don't sacrifice Isaac then, because it's not your child. You have no right to do it. But initially, Abraham's ready to do it because he says, it's not my child. You gave it to me. If you want me to relinquish this child, I must do as you asked me to do. If you look at the story of Hannah that we read on Rosh Hashanah, when she gave birth to Shemuel, she says, I named him Shemuel because God heard my prayer, but also because I borrowed this child from God. What God gives us children, they're on loan to us. They're not there to serve our interests. Sometimes, God forbid, parents can see their children as a way to boost their own ego or their own accomplishments. Your children are a holy treasure that God entrusted with you. And just like if someone gives you something as a custodian, as a guardian, you have to watch over it and protect it and do with it as then with the instructions of the person who entrusted it to you. God gives us the Torah. That's his instructions, how to raise our children, how to educate our children, what to teach our children, the values we should inculcate in our children. As custodians, we must follow God's instructions. It's not our children to do with as we please. So that is the opening section about the laws of childbirth. And so therefore the Torah says that the first 40 days, the woman should not go to the temple. Why? Because what is the temple? A temple is the sanctuary. The holy temple was a place to come closer to God. And what God is saying to the Jewish mother is, you don't need to go to the temple. That bassinet with that beautiful baby in it, that is my sanctuary. That is where you will find my presence. In your children, you will find my presence. And therefore, if you want to come close to me, all you have to do is embrace your children, love your children, give them the values of the Torah, teach them. And that will be your connection to me through the child who I entrusted with you. Now, you may ask, why a double period for women? And here we have a great example. You know, a lot of times people say Torah is chauvinistic, treats men better than women, let's say. And it's actually the opposite is true. And it's a lengthy subject. It's not for now to elaborate on such a subject right now. the role of men and women, which are equal but different. But just that you understand something fascinating. According to our tradition, the birth of a girl is twice as miraculous as the birth of a boy. The birth of a boy is an amazing miracle, a beautiful, healthy child. Although God leaves one thing undone, and to deviate for a second, the famous story, someone once asked the great sage Rabbi Akiva, God gives you a beautiful child, perfect, every limb, every organ, every detail, every blood cell is in place. Who are you to take a scalpel and circumcise, mutilate the child? And Rabbi Akiva said to this non-believer, this heretic, he said, whose deeds are greater, man's or God's? And he said, what do you mean God's? And Rabbi Akiva says, no, man's. He took out a stalk of wheat and a cake. He said, what's better, the wheat or the cake? Clearly the cake. God gives us the wheat, but we have to make the cake and the bread. So too, Rabbi Akiva says, the idea of circumcision is the 8th day. 7 represents the 7 days of the week, nature. We connect the child to something supernatural. 8, the divine. 8 represents divine, like the name of last week's Torah portion. And we remember the message of circumcision, which is God wants us to take everything he created, which is so beautiful and perfect like this child, but to enhance it, to elevate it, to even improve on what God gave us. But going back to the birth of a girl, it's a double miracle. Why? Because when you hold a little baby girl in your arms who was just born, the greatest miracle is that within this baby girl is already the apparatus, mechanism that God can be a mother herself and give birth to her own children. So it's like a miracle within a miracle. The birth of the baby girl and the ability for that girl one day to give birth to her own children. And therefore, it's a double level of holiness. And therefore, there's a double period of staying with the child at home and not going to the temple. And then the Torah says, bring a sacrifice. And here's an amazing idea. The sacrifice is gratitude, thanking God for the child, but also atonement. You know why? Because the parent is saying to the God, I know when I raise this child, I will make mistakes. Is there any parent who can say, I'm a perfect parent, I haven't made mistakes? I have fully lived up to my responsibility as a parent. I've never neglected my responsibility towards my children. Unfortunately, we all know, either as children or as parents, that we're all human beings. And that's part of life. We'll make mistakes. No one's perfect. There are times that I should have been there for my child, but I was lazy. Or I put my own interest before theirs. Or I didn't do what I needed to do to teach them the proper lessons in life. Or I didn't show them the love I was supposed to show them. So the mother brings the child and says, I ask for atonement in advance. I will do my best, God, to raise this child according to your will. I will follow your instructions because it's your child, not mine. I was entrusted with this child, but I must raise them based on the instructions of the owner, which is you, God. Our children pass through us. We have the privilege of raising them, but they go on to the world and they go beyond us and they live beyond us. They're our ambassadors into a world that we will never see to some degree, typically. But we have instructions how to send these children off into the world. And as parents giving them a Jewish education, today is Yom HaShoah, remember the 6 million. 75 years after the Holocaust ended. And if you could ask the 6 million before they died, what's your last wish? What would they say? Could only imagine what they would say. Remember us. Never forget. Teach the world the lessons of hate, of bigotry, of racism, of evil, of anti-Semitism. But I'm sure one of the things they would have said to us is make sure Hitler doesn't win. Make sure our deaths are not in vain. Make sure you raise Jewish children. More important than the 6 million being remembered in museums and on monuments, engraved on monuments, is that they're remembered in our hearts and in our minds by living Jewishly, living Jews. Hitler wanted the opposite of living Jews. Our greatest revenge is living Jewishly and raising our children to live Jewishly, so they understand what they carry within them. a heritage, knowledge, passing on our traditions. That's what it's all about. And as Jewish parents, we have an extra responsibility. All parents have a responsibility to their kids. You have to love your kids. You have to raise them, teach them a profession. The Talmud says you don't teach your child a profession. It's as though you taught them thievery, because they're going to have no other way to make a living except stealing. So if you don't teach your children a good career, give them an education, the Talmud says you taught them how to be a thief, because you forced them into illicit behavior and unethical practices. So it's a huge responsibility to be a parent, and even greater responsibility to be a Jewish parent. And no one can live up to it fully. And therefore the Torah says the woman brings a sacrifice to atone in advance, saying, God, forgive me for the mistakes, for the errors I will make. I will strive every day to live up to my responsibilities. I'll always try to put my children first. Instead of staying late in the office to make another deal or more money, I'll come home to spend quality time with my children. I won't overlook or sacrifice my children for the sake of other material gain or purposes or leisure, entertainment, or whatever it may be. That's a huge responsibility. So therefore, the sacrifice is brought in advance to atone for any wrongdoing and mistakes we'll make as parents eventually. Now we come to the subject of the main subject of this week's Torah portion, which is leprosy. So the Torah tells us that if a person had a lesion, a skin disease called tsaras, he would go to the Kohen. Now, why the Kohen? Not the dermatologist, but the Kohen. Why the Kohen? Because it's not a physical ailment, it's a spiritual ailment. So you need a Kohen to examine it. But our rabbis say something else. The rabbis say that a Kohen, starting with Aaron, the first Kohen, the trademark, the landmark quality of a Kohen is his love for every Jew. That's why the Kohanim are the ones who bless the Jewish people. Bi'ahava, as they say, with love. If you're going to examine someone else's flaws, like the Kohen has to examine the leprosy, you have to come from a place of love. You could only judge people accurately and fairly if you're looking at them with love. You know, one of the things about parents is they love their children. In a healthy family, parents love their children. And therefore, since they love their children, hopefully, even if they see flaws in their children, out of love, to correct, to improve, to better their children. Same thing, like the Kohen, when we have to look at other people's failings or shortcomings, we should only do to improve rather than to reprove, not to seek to rebuke, but to seek to improve the person. And one of the ways to know if you're judging accurately is, do you see the person's flaws only, or can you see the whole person? Do you have a holistic look at the person, or only do you see the negative? If you're a Kohen and you see the good in a person, then you can judge their flaws as well and try to help them. But if what only stands out is the negativity in that person, then the flaw might be in you. And that's why rabbis teach something very powerful. The Baal Shem Tov said that your fellow man is a mirror. Sometimes when you see the negativity in someone else, it's a reflection of your own negativity. And the reason you're seeing it is because God's trying to show you how you look. Because sometimes we project to others our own flaws. You ever been accused by someone of doing something and it's ludicrous and you think, why is that person saying that? And then you realize because that's the way they think. They're judging you through their own prism. And therefore, what we say about others sometimes reflects more about ourselves than about say that sometimes we judge others by our own yardstick. And therefore, if you only see them, maybe a sign that you need to look within rather than look without. What you're seeing is a mirror. It's a reflection that you're projecting and projection is a word in psychology today, projection. But the Torah talks about projection, that we project our weaknesses and flaws onto others. And so sometimes rather than judge others, because we're always told to judge other people favorably, we have to look into ourselves, of course. Now, to talk about the sin of Lashon Hara, I mentioned the story of Miriam in the Bible. But there's another famous story about Lashon Hara. We just came from the holiday of Passover. And we spent a lot of time at the Seder talking about how God took us out of slavery. But one of the things we didn't talk about at the Seder is how did we get into slavery in the first place? What led us into slavery? But we know the story because it's in the Torah portions of Vayeshev, Miketz, Vayigash, Vayechi, 4 portions in the book of Genesis. It all started with Joseph and the brothers. And yes, Joseph, the great Joseph, didn't start out so great. How did he start out? The Torah tells us explicitly. Vayaveh Yosef et dibatam ra'a el avihem. Joseph would run and tattletale on his brothers. He would report to his father all the wrongdoing and the mistakes that his brothers were doing. And that aroused jealousy. That aroused hatred of the brothers towards Joseph, which they carried out against him by throwing him into the pit and selling him into slavery, which led to Joseph being sold into slavery, then thrown into prison, ultimately being freed from prison as he became the viceroy of Egypt after interpreting Pharaoh's dreams and saving the land from famine. And when the brothers come to Egypt to purchase food, he recognizes them, devises a whole scheme, accuses them of being spies, ultimately reveals his identity, is reunited with his family, invites them to live in Egypt. And after Joseph and the brothers die, the Pharaoh starts persecuting the Jews in Egypt. Rabbi say, how did we end up in slavery? It all started with Joseph and the brothers, the jealousy and the hatred. How did the sibling rivalry begin? And the beauty of the Torah is not an old book. It's a relevant book, just like leprosy and the lessons of quarantining and the lessons of social distancing from people who speak Lashon Hara that could be all understood today. I've never understood what it means to be quarantined and to yearn for contact with other people and to realize how blessed we are. When we come back to shul, we shouldn't say one negative word about each other. We should just be so happy we could be back with our friends and community. Now we could live this week's Torah portion. But we also know today the ill harms, even in families. That's why the Torah tells the story of Miriam and Moshe. Miriam and Moshe, they loved each other. But Miriam still spoke gossip about her brother and created harm and hurt and splintered the family. And sometimes in families, even a brother, a sister, a daughter-in-law, mother-in-law, if someone speaks about the others, and we can even destroy families. And the Torah is not ashamed to tell us. That's what happened to Joseph and the brothers. Joseph spoke Lashon Hara, gossip about his brothers. And therefore, it led to jealousy, it led to hatred, it led to so much pain in Joseph's life as he was sold into slavery and suffered in Egypt, but ultimately led to the misery of the Jews as we all ended up in Egypt because of that and suffered hundreds of years of slavery. And the rabbis are trying to show us the terrible, terrible repercussions that could happen from negative speech. And we all know there are families that people spoke about others, not heeding these instructions of not speaking Lashon Hara, of guarding our lips. As the rabbis say that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, listen twice before you speak. And God gave us 2 gates, teeth and mouth, to guard our speech before we speak, to make sure that what we're saying is putting positivity out and not negativity. And the very story of Joseph and the brothers teaches us this fundamental lesson about proper speech and the grave repercussions. But I want to take it a step further. Not only human Lashon Hara, speaking about other human beings, but our rabbis say, what was the sin of the spies and why they did not go into the land of Israel? And why is the story of the 12 spies right after the story of Miriam speaking Lashon Hara about her brothers? And our rabbis say, or it's actually the reverse. The story of Miriam follows the story of the spies. And the rabbis say because the sin of the spies was they spoke Lashon Hara about the land of Israel. They defamed the land of Israel. And because of that, our rabbis say, the Torah puts the story of Miriam following that to say, Miriam, you should have learned what happened to the spies. You should have learned the lesson of negative speech, how the spies, as a result, inflamed the fear of the Jews, and they stayed in the desert for 40 years because of speaking ill about the land of Israel. And that's another very relevant subject, those who defame Israel. It's okay to see flaws in Israel. Every country has flaws. But when all you see is the flaws of Israel, that's Lashon Hara. That's seeking not to say something constructive, but just to destroy with negative words. When those who are anti-Israel only see bad in Israel, not in any other country, they see Israel as worse than Iran, that's Lashon from a place of malice. And so sometimes Lashon Hara is not just speaking against people, but speaking about even an inanimate object like the land of Israel. If I speak ill of your creation, if you're an artist and you painted a beautiful painting or something, and I disparage it, then it's a reflection on you, and I've hurt you. And so not only shouldn't we speak ill about others, but even about what represents them. Talmud talks at great length. If somebody acquired something and they ask you their opinion, should you lie and say it's beautiful, or should you say, no, I don't like it? And the Talmud says, it's better to lie for the sake of peace. That's how important peaceful relations is. That if someone acquired something, there's no point of saying something negative about it. Someone said, how do you like my new house? I love it. It's beautiful. How was dinner? I made you dinner. It's delicious. But it's not true. It wasn't delicious. It doesn't matter. In mutar l'shanot, sometimes you could tell the truth, and it's Lashon Hara. It's a sin. And sometimes you could tell a lie, and you did a mitzvah. People always say, but it's the truth. I have to tell the truth. Not every truth has to be told. And guess what? In Judaism, even a little white lie sometimes is a mitzvah. Because it's more important about human feelings. And if we've offended or insulted somebody and the damage that can cause. And I want to tell you something fascinating. Everything in the order of Torah is precise. This week's Torah portion follows last week's Torah portion. Last week's Torah portion was all about the laws of kosher. Suddenly we go into the laws of Lashon Hara. What's the connection between kosher and Lashon Hara? And Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, one of the great ethicists, says something beautiful. He said, Jews are very careful about the laws of kosher. Ask a Jew who eats kosher, would he ever eat a piece of bacon and ham or eggs? Say, God forbid, I would starve. I live on bread and water before I put non-kosher food in my mouth. But that same Jew very often, who's so careful not to eat anything that's not perfectly glatt kosher, who checks the package, makes sure everything's perfect, just speaks words that are Lashon Hara, harmful to others. And so Rabbi Yisrael Salanta says, you know why Lashon Hara follows kosher? Because just like you have to be careful to make sure that everything that goes into your mouth is glatt kosher, you have to be equally careful that everything that comes out of your mouth should be glatt kosher. If we were as careful that everything that comes out should be as kosher as everything that goes in, how much more beautiful our lives becomes part of your being, and it adds to your physical and spiritual health. Speaking the proper words will add to your physical and spiritual well-being. I want to pause before I continue to see if anyone has any questions on anything we discussed. If you do, just put it up on the chat. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. And if not, we'll continue with our class. Okay, if you have a question anytime, just go ahead and type it right in. Now, I mentioned to you that in the biblical times, like in this week's Torah portion, there was three forms. There was saras, leprosy on the garments, and there was even saras on a building, on the house. Now, you heard the term 3 strikes and you're out. If a person had saras on their building, they were warned. It's like a first warning. The building actually had to be demolished. Then it would afflict his garments, and then finally his skin, and that's when he was quarantined. Now, the idea of saras afflicting the house and then the garments and then the skin represents the going from the more exterior to the more interior. And when it flicks your skin, that's when the Torah says, now it's time to go outside of the camp. Badad yeshav, you should sit in isolation. By the way, in Israel, we keep on using the word quarantining. In Hebrew, in Israel, the Israelis, the word they use is badad. Badad means quarantining. But the words badad, the letters beis dalad dalad, is an acronym for a verse in the book of Proverbs. B'chol derachech de'eu, know God in all your ways. Which leads me to answering a question that was just asked, is quarantining a punishment? So, in biblical times, it wasn't a punishment, it was a lesson. It was God saying, go to your room and think about what you did. And when you're ready, you'll come out. Think about how your words are socially harmful to others, to our society. It contaminates and pollutes the ear. It affects others negatively. You could be an agent for positivity or for negative. You could say words that heal or words that harm. That's our choice every minute, what kind of words we're going to choose to say. So if you're asking, is today's quarantining a punishment of God? Everyone has to answer that question for themselves. Surely nothing happens in vain. And everyone could extrapolate what they think God is trying to say to us with this quarantining. But one thing I think everyone could agree, the rhetoric in our society is very high-pitched. There's a lot of negativity, never like before. You know, I heard this rabbi said the first sin of Adam and Eve was they ate from the apple. And what was the great sin? So they ate a fruit, such a terrible sin. The sin wasn't just that they ate from the apple, it was the cover-up. When God comes to Adam, he says, why did you disobey my commandment? He says, oh, my wife made me do it. And when God comes to the Eve, she says, oh, it was the snake. Everyone's passing the buck. No one's taking responsibility. And God says, I give you a woman, I give you a companion, I give you a helpmate, I give you a soulmate to enjoy your life with. And instead of being grateful, you're now going to use that to excuse your behavior. Such ingratitude. And therefore the sin was Lashon Hara. Each one blaming the other. Each one cast aspersion on the other. Something we all do today. Republicans, Democrats, the list goes on and on. Let's blame the others instead of looking within ourselves. And so we all know that the anti-Semitism was at an all-time high, of course, before this pandemic. It's ironic how life changes. Like, if you would have asked any Jew, today's Yom HaShoah, what would be the subject of 2020? Everyone would say anti-Semitism. It was the new problem of our generation. It had resurfaced after 70 years of the Holocaust. Suddenly we saw a resurgence of anti-Semitism. Suddenly now a pandemic comes. Now there's a new problem. We don't always see what's coming. On Yom Kippur, we say the Nasana Tokeh prayer. We say, who will live, who will die, who will become rich, who will become poor, who will be elevated, who will be demoted, who by water, who by fire. And then one of the words we say on Yom Kippur is, mi ba magefa, who by a pandemic. And I know when I said those words, I didn't really think it could happen. I may have thought about who will live, who will die. Will I live out the year? Will I be promoted or demoted? Will I have success or failure? But pandemic? It's like the words, who by starvation? Who in America thinks they could possibly die by starvation? No one thought you could die from a pandemic, from a plague. But here we are. How many people have lost their lives to this pandemic? What the Torah tells us is everlasting and eternal. And so the lessons of the pandemic, why God sent it, only God knows. But surely we could ask ourselves, and I mentioned this morning in my video, one of the things everyone's doing is walking around with masks. I know when I have a mask on my mouth, I'm more careful about what I say because it takes more effort. There's a filter. We have to, when we take off these masks, God willing soon when this pandemic is over, let's imagine we have a mask on our mouth and filter our words and make sure what we say is proper. And we don't say things that are negative or harmful to other people. So going back to the three layers, first the home, then the garments, and then the skin of the person. But the message is actually a positive message. The essence of the person always remains good. Yes, your sins are skin on your skin. or more externally on your garments are not clean. And that's always a metaphor. Your garments aren't clean represents, don't throw stones on people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones on other people's glass houses, right? We all have unclean, soiled garments. Our homes are not necessarily beacons of light and positivity. The saras, leprosy in the home says to us, conversations in your home, good positive conversations around the dinner table about others. What does husband and wife speak about amongst them? From God's divine eye? Every word that's spoken is heard, every action is seen, even behind closed doors. So that teaches us to be aware of what goes on in our homes. Are our garments clean or soiled? Before we point fingers at others, we point 3 fingers back at ourselves. Look at yourself. You're a mirror for someone else. You're projecting yourself. Look at your skin. But saras never reflects your essence, your soul. Why? Because your inside is always good. And as long as you have that spark within you, that neshama, that soul, you could resuscitate and reignite that ember within yourself of positivity. Person could feel I'm inundated, I'm inculcated with so much negativity, so much bias, so much hatred, and I feel like I'm poisoned. But remember, it's only skin deep. Your essence is never poisoned. Your essence always remains pure, and therefore you could always rehabilitate yourself and learn how to be a beacon of light and positivity and project goodness about others. There's nothing more hurtful than finding out someone spoke bad about you behind your back. And everyone's had this feeling, you say, why didn't the person come talk to me if they had a problem? And you know what's one of the best feelings in the world? When you find out someone said something good about you behind your back. Because they didn't say it to you to flatter you or to make you feel good. They said it because they saw the good in you. And you know why people like to hear good things about themselves? Not because of their ego necessarily. Because when you say something good about someone, whether to their face or behind their back, it's like holding up a mirror. Try this experiment. Say something good to someone about someone, a genuine, sincere compliment, and you'll see automatically they smile. You know why they smile? Because you raise the mirror to them and show them something good about themselves that they couldn't see about themselves. And that's what the power of speech is. God gave us speech so we could build bridges, so we could communicate with one another, so we could have friendship, so we could show each other the good of each other. But instead, we sometimes hold up a mirror that may not be even accurate to show people their flaws, to show people their weaknesses. And sometimes we lead them to believe things about them for our own bias or for our own ego. As the Talmud says, Lashon Hara is a form of miskabed beklon chavero. You seek honor at the expense of someone else. It's like patting yourself on the back. I put you down. There's a story about 2 Hasidic Rebbe, 2 of his kids were fighting in the courtyard. Who's taller? And they're going, who's taller? Who's taller? And then one kid stands up on a box to make himself taller. The other kid pushes him off. And the Rebbe called his children in and he said, you never make yourself taller by knocking someone else down. The fatal mistake we think is when we point out other people's weaknesses, by contrast, by comparison, we make ourselves look better. But that's not the way we make ourselves look better. The only way we could be nobler is being noble than our former self, not by trying to raise ourselves up over others. So there's a lot of psychology why people speak negatively. And therefore the rabbis say the word saras doesn't just mean leprosy. And by the way, it's not connected to the word saros. That's a little bit different. Sarah is narrowness. And rabbis say something very deep and profound. They say, where saras, leprosy, comes from? Lashon Hara. But you know where Lashon Hara comes from? Having a narrow eye. Having a narrow, judgmental eye. So I once saw a bumper sticker that said, don't believe everything you think. Sometimes we think just because we think something, it's the case. We look too narrowly at others. Look with a broad eye. You know what it means to look with a broad eye? Look generously at others. See the positive, see the good. There's something called a missing tile syndrome. If I walk into a room with 1,000 tiles on the roof and one tile is blackened and stained by a water leak in the roof, if 1,000 tiles are white, I don't even notice the tiles. But if one is black, I suddenly notice the black tile. There's something called negativity bias. We notice the negative more than the positive. If 10 things are in your body right now, There's most probably, I don't know how many millions and millions of things working well. How many blood cells, white cells, red cells, organs, limbs, hundreds of millions. I don't even know the number. If you know the number, type the number. But the point is that you don't notice it when everything's running well. The minute you have a pain in a part of your body, you notice it. That's human nature. Same thing in the world. When everything's running smoothly, everyone's doing their job and everything's going beautifully, people don't notice it. But if something's wrong, then they notice it. You know the story about this, it's a story told about this man who worked very hard. His wife stayed home with the kids. And one day he comes home to his wife and says, I'm out in the morning, 6 o'clock, I work so hard all day. What do you do all day? What do you do all day? She didn't respond. The next day he comes home from work. His house is a wreck. Everything's in shambles. House is a big mess. And the kids are yelling, fighting, and things are thrown all over the place. The kids made a mess. He calls his wife, honey, where are you? No response. He goes running up to the bedroom. He comes into the room. She's laying behind the blankets with the pillow propped up with a book and a hot cup of coffee and relaxing. He says, what are you doing? What's going on? The house is a wreck. It's chaos in the house. And she says, honey, you asked me last night, what do you do all day? Well, today I didn't do it. When we come home and the house is neat, everything's well, we take it for granted sometimes. You don't express enough gratitude. The minute it's missing or something's out of order or there's a problem, then we notice it. And sometimes that's why disruption is sometimes good. There's a lot of disruption in life now. And God forbid anyone should be sick. And today you may have seen Eli Beer was flown back to Israel on a private plane. Sheldon Adelson sent his plane to Miami to take him back to Israel. He was reunited with his wife, Gitti, and his kids. I haven't seen him in months. If you go on social media, you'll see the most moving sight in the world. Literally every Hatzalah ambulance and motorcycle, except the ones that were, I guess, tending to patients. And I know many of our members donated ambucycles. I see one of our members, Jane Shalom, that had donated an ambucycle. Well, you know where your ambucycle was today? There's aerial shots of hundreds of ambulances and motorcycles that went to the airport to welcome Eli Beer back to Israel after being on a ventilator for 3 weeks in Miami. And a procession of hundreds of ambucycles and ambulances led him back to his home in Jerusalem, welcomed him back. All the 6,000 volunteers who were his big extended United Hatzalah family welcomed him back to Israel. That's the beauty of the Jewish people. That's unity. That's love. But we don't have to wait for someone to be on a ventilator for 3 weeks to appreciate their presence. That's what this is teaching us, maybe more than anything else. If you have any questions, just please go ahead and type it in. But this is the message of this week's Parsha, that we have to become more positive people. We have to speak positively. But it has to start with a good eye. If you have a good eye, then you won't even see the negative in another person. You'll only see the positive. And I'll just conclude with the following story. It was a great rabbi, and then we'll open it up to some conversation. It was a great rabbi in Jerusalem. His name was Rabbi Levine. He was called the Tzaddik of Jerusalem. And when the student sees him, he crosses the street. Rabbi Levine was very disappointed that the student who he loved was crossing the street, trying to avoid him. So he runs across the street and he confronts this young man. He says, Chaim, how are you doing? I'm so happy to see you, but tell me, why did you cross the street? And the student says, Rabbi, I was embarrassed because since I've left the yeshiva, I've left Judaism. I stopped being religious. And I wasn't wearing my yarmulke, and I didn't want to sadden you. I didn't want to hurt you that you should see me without a kippah. So I crossed the street to avoid you. And Rabbi Levine, Ari Levine, looked at his student and said, as you can see, I'm a very short old man. He said, I can't see what's on top of your head. All I can see is what's in your heart. And that's what it means to look with a generous eye, with a good eye. To look with a good eye is don't judge people for what they don't do. Look to their heart, try to find the good, try to see the good. And if you see good, you'll automatically speak good about others rather than speak negative. And if you notice negative in others, be honest and say, why do I see the negativity? Is it my own internal jealousy or bias that makes me see the negativity? Am I able to see all the good in the person and see this negative flaw in context, or is all I see negative? Because if all you see is negative, then most likely it's not that person's flaws, it's your own flaws. So here we are in 2020 learning the laws of quarantining as we're practicing quarantining. And we can understand what the Metzora, who Rabbi say Metzora, Metzora, the leper is called Metzora. The disease is called Saras, but he's called Metzora because he omits bad. He elicits and speaks negatively, slander, defaming other people's character. That's what we call character assassination. You literally kill somebody with a bad word. You could ruin their reputation. You could ruin their opportunities in life. You could do untold damage. And once you spoke it, it's out of your control. And so the best way to combat negative speech is by increasing in positive speech. And we're all on the internet today, spreading words out there, putting it out there for the world to see. Make sure we're putting out positive words. So what a unique experience that we're having right now. Learning the laws of quarantining while being quarantined, and learning the lesson that the Metzora must have felt as he sat isolated 3,000 years ago in temple or biblical times. And he had to learn the two lessons. Number one, your words have an impact on society. And if you're a danger to society, you're a harm, you need to be quarantined. You need to be taken out of the community if you're bringing about rift and, God forbid, hatred amongst human beings. But furthermore, in addition to that, when you sit alone, you'll realize the gift of friendship, and you'll yearn to come back in contact with others. And then you will appreciate the gift of friendship and utilize it, and the gift of speech, which is a bridge that God gave us to connect one soul to another soul. Now I'm going to take any questions, either by, you could either turn on your mic if you want to ask a question, or if you'd like to type it in, whichever you prefer, and we'll try to have a little conversation. I want to remind everyone that at 5 o'clock you could join us for Yom HaShoah with a conversation with Jacqueline Goldman to remember the 6 million in the Holocaust under this Yom HaShoah, 75th year commemoration. Go ahead if anyone would like to ask a question or type in a question.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So
how are you, Jane?
I'm doing great. Hi,
Yes,
Mara.
thank you.
I'm doing great. I'm back from the hospital, and my life was saved. So I must say, the whole experience is much more meaningful today than it ever has been in my whole life.
Thank God. We're praying, and thank God we're so happy to hear that.
I'm good. No, I'm good. I mean, you know, I'm all sewed up around my head, but okay, that's fine.
Thank you for sharing the good news.
It's wonderful. And thanks for talking today. It was wonderful. I appreciate it. And our movie last night was super.
Yes.
That worked out so nicely. So many people saw it.
First time we've had it. Thank you for arranging the movies, and this is very unique having them online. Maybe even after we go back to having in-house movies, we'll also maybe offer it online.
I think it would be amazing because there's so many people who can't really come physically. And I had a lot of emails today with deep appreciation that they could enjoy it and be part of what's going on. So thank you, Myra. Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
My vote.
Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I do have a statement where I would love to have this continue even after we are let out for all the obvious reasons that I'm up in Michigan and you're down in Florida.
Michigan.
And I really appreciate. I love seeing you, and I've learned a lot, and it means a lot to me to be part of this.
Thank you. It's always great. It's our benefit, too, that we get to see you. So I think we will maybe continue this. Anyone else? I see Ken is online. Ken always has a question. No such thing as Ken learning Torah without a question. Don't bottle it up, Ken.
I don't really have a question. I just want to thank you for this. And also to Scott, they say that you can smoke grass in Michigan, but you can't cut the grass.
No, that's very true. Everyone's using that joke up here right now.
That's right. You've got some governor.
Yeah, no, it's well, it's that'll be changed in time, but she's being very cautious and rightfully so. I actually had corona. I
Oh,
was
wow.
not. I
Oh
was not.
no, my God.
It's okay. I'm fine.
Well,
I
that's
did.
great.
Thank you, Jane. I did not have a serious case of it. I did not. I didn't have an elevated temperature, so I couldn't even get the test for it. But I had all the other symptoms: the
Wow.
shortness of breath, the
And you
diminution
know,
of my lung capacity, everything short of a fever. And because the tests are in such
but
a
you're okay
shortage,
now.
I'm totally fine now. I've been
That's amazing.
symptom free for about 3 to 4 weeks.
That's amazing. I had brain surgery last Wednesday.
I'm glad.
I had a blood clot in my brain, and they said, you must go to JFK Hospital. I was petrified.
Yeah.
I was petrified. But they were just miraculous. We know that is a virus hospital. And I was in the ICU for 2 days until the drain was pulled out. And I must tell you, the ICU staff and the nurses who worked tirelessly working with these doctors, including my 2 cousins in New York at Montefiore, they're head of the whole Montefiore task force, in the emergency rooms. I send donations, but you can't thank these people enough. And I felt so blessed that, and I was so worried that maybe I'd contract the virus during all of this, and I didn't. But you're thinking of yourself and so many other people who have really been saved by these people. There's just not enough we can do for them. So
No.
the
All the
experience
restaurants
is so I don't know, even I don't have words for it. I'm overwhelmed, actually. I'm really overwhelmed.
I know a number of doctors and nurses,
Right.
and it's a very, very stressful time
Oh,
for them if they're working at the hospitals. If they're not working at the
yes.
hospitals,
Yes.
there's still very stressed about it for all the obvious reasons, just like all of us are. But I have some things, I have some procedures that I need to do,
Yes.
and everything's been put on hold.
Oh, yes.
Because every hospital up here is exclusively short of an emergency.
Well, Scott,
Every hospital is strictly for corona. Right?
it's unbelievable, but to be in an ICU situation with a mask on my face,
But right.
I can honestly tell you, you're thinking of these people first.
Yep.
But it's scary. It's very scary.
It's very scary.
But I'm so happy to hear that you're well.
Yeah, no, I'm completely fine.
Now you have the antibodies.
That's assuming that I really had corona.
Oh, that's right. You're not sure.
And we don't know that yet. I've been trying to get the test that'll tell us that, and they don't have that test either.
I heard that. I heard the Michigan governor the other day. Nobody has test kits. It's just
right.
Pathetic.
Yeah. Now the scariest thing is that I had oral surgery on January 6th.
Oh boy.
I've been wearing a mask since mid-January.
Right.
I've been washing my hands.
Sure.
I've been the shopping carts. I've stayed away from people. If someone coughs or sneezes, I turn and I walk in the other direction while I'm holding my breath. I've been doing this since mid-January, and I still got something, whether it was corona or something else. And I say corona because I had all the symptoms short of a fever.
But you might be lucky. You might not have had it.
No, I'm probably luckier if I had it and I had a mild case.
Yeah, a mild case.
And I'm confident I did have it because all the symptoms were there. Even symptoms they hadn't talked about yet were there. And I had them, and I was talking to my doctors, and I said, you know what, I have these symptoms. You guys should make note of it and tell the right people, the appropriate people, because maybe that's part of this whole thing. And I found out that it was.
Wow.
So
I'm confident I had the corona. I'm confident I had a mild case.
Well, let's do what the rabbi said. Let's be very positive.
No, to me being positive, yeah, I'm into that. I agree.
I'm going to tell you now, it works.
Yes, I agree. It definitely works.
Yes.
Honestly,
Make a big
it's hard
difference.
to believe it's.
Have a good day, everyone, and we'll see you at 5 o'clock.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Myra.
I won't be here at 5, but I'll be here the next time.
5 o'clock.
Okay, that's a deal.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, everyone.
Bye, Janie. I'm so glad you're feeling better.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Jane,
Bye,
you look
everyone.
great. Keep up the good healing, a complete and speedy recovery.
I don't have a choice. There are about 50 staples in my head. So I'll let you know when that's finished.
And you look great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Have a good day, everyone. See you later. Bye.
Okay. So they were